Hi all, let's have a look at the amazing game 5 that I was given by Deepmind recently of the 20 game set. Alphazero was playing white against Stockfish again. D4, knight f6, knight f3, e6. We have c4, b6. So Queen's Indian territory and the Capablanca variation here because there's bishop b4 check, bishop d2 and the bishop drops back. So a nuisance check to disrupt white's control of d4. The bishop's not usually that well placed on d2 here, so it's kind of justified that check. Knight c3, and we have c6. Now bishop f4. This is a little bit odd from a chess-based live book perspective. Usually white just gets on in castles. For example, this position with d5. But sometimes the bishop does go to f4 now, so maybe it's not such a big shock. This position is white's thought to have a small advantage, but move order is very important in chess. I mean, here there might be dangers with c takes d5. In the game, it is slightly different that black in the game with bishop f4 castles, but we'll see now after e4 d5 we get very unusual territory. White now plays e5 and we're completely out of human live book with this position, it seems. There has been an important stem game with knight d2, as in back row against Bundsman Paris 2006, and this was a very, very nice game by back row. Just to quickly just run through it, white playing very aggressively, sacking the d4 pawn, playing knight b5. It was a very, very interesting tactical game to check out as well. And here, yeah, white was winning the black queen after king c6. There's queen d5. So that was a really crushing little game. There's a stem game to this game. But that was with knight d2. Now here we have this move e5. With the white king in the center, this actually seems a little bit dangerous after knight e4. White now plays, Alphazero plays c takes here, and black can now play c takes. Now this is a very interesting situation. Yeah, white castled here. White cannot take on e4, it seems, without incurring a significant disadvantage. For example, here queen takes d4, and then queen b4 check. Now if queen d2, there's bishop takes e4, and if bishop d2, black can probably take this pawn and hit e5 with a nice small advantage at least. So white castles, but here knight takes c3. For me personally, seems like on the surface it's a scary thing to do. There's this backward c pawn on the c file. There's a nice outpost square potentially, and also this bishop on b7 can start controlling these light squares and lock down that pawn. So it basically seems like a case of potentially backward pawn torture. So how can this be a fun position for white? And black seems to start the torture with bishop a6. We have rook e1, knight c6. So there's ideas of knight a5 to c4 as well. An important move now, h4. This does support moves like knight g5 more easily under different conditions. Rook c8 is played. And now we have the start of an unusual looking maneuver, rook e3. This is quite clever in its own right. It's a way of defending this backward pawn from the pressure, which could build up. You can imagine black building up on c3. It's a way of defending, but also potentially putting pressure on the black position over here. Now black played rook c7. You might think, well, can't we just play knight a5 to go to knight c4? Well, white has knight h2 to vacate f3, and it looks, actually, from a technical perspective, this seems okay to have the rook here. If, for example, f6, then taking queen e2, that's pleasant enough. So there's no, doesn't seem a big deal, this position. If this fairly pointless knight manoeuvre to see what white's doing. Maybe the bishop can drop back here. White seems to be fine here. The pressure has been relieved, and we have this kind of potentially aggressive and useful rook on f3. So it does seem a little bit awkward at first sight to play this way. But the alternative of passive rooks is far less appetizing. Just behind this pawn, it's going to be asking for trouble with bishop a3 as well. It's not possible for white to. Why would white just be pacified to c3? So rook c7 is played, knight g5, h6. We have now the knight going back to h3. It does seem possible for the knight to go to f3 as well. But h3 does seem fancier and more useful because the f pawn is not blocked in. But even here, this scenario, if the knight goes to h2, is also kind of handy if the knight pops then on g4. Actually, this configuration is quite attacking, even if black does seem aimed at c3. White can play stuff like this, potentially. Knight sack, and it can get really dangerous, really dangerous, like potentially winning position with tactics favouring white. That's just one example. So it is actually possible to drop the knight to f3 as well. This looks as though there's something to do with f2, because otherwise why would white drop the knight here? It's something to do with the liberation of the f pawn. But funny enough, now after king h7, no, the f pawn is blocked. Yeah, it's fascinating, some of the moves here. If queen h5, this doesn't really do too much. Say here, check. As long as after knight h3, black doesn't allow bishop takes h6 and plays king h7, then that's fine. If black allows, a sack, then that's just asking for trouble, and black will be obliterated. Even if the bishop comes to this diagonal, it's just asking to be obliterated. For example, like this, bang, rook takes f7. Big advantage to white. So anyway, rook f3. So again, it's not about the f pawn at the moment, but keep a track on this f pawn, because this is a French defense pawn structure fundamentally on this side of the board, and usually in the French defense we're looking for f4, f5 as a theme, a strategic break. So just bear that in mind here for a moment. So we have knight a5, and now check. The king goes to g8, and now rook e1. So some shuffling here to have the rook. It seems overprotecting e5, and it does seem almost as if Alphazero is literally following a Nimzovichian overprotection of e5 in a very abstract sense, as we're about to see. Nimzovich believed, as white, especially against the castle king on the king side, that the e5 point was the square to really overprotect. It coordinates pieces. Well, it's a form of prophylaxis. Sometimes it's discouraging f6. Like here, there'll be lateral pressure on e6 after. So it's positional play, Nimzovichian positional play, basically. We have king h8. On a move like queen d7, then maybe white can start to play for a kingside attack with g4, and disregarding the h4 pawn. If this is taken, then this is really dangerous after g5, and the queen can drop back, and black's king can be torn to shreds. This kind of thing is now possible. It can get very nasty very quickly for black in this kind of scenario. So black king, beware. So we have king h8, but still okay. Queen d1 now, knight c6. The bishop drops back here. So for the moment, this does tie the rook down. If there's intentions to double the rooks, clearly f7 is tying down this whole plan of torturing c3. If both rooks wanted to be involved, it's going to be a bit trickier. So bishop c4. So attacking a2, that's protected at the moment, and also, of course, has an idea like bishop takes h6. Now black parries that, but now there's a positional plan revealed, knight f4. That justifies the whole knight h3, because now the knight's going to come to this h5 square, which puts a dampener on later g6 because there might be things like knight f6. So it's a very nice square to be in this position, the h5 square. Queen e8 is played. Now, not to h5 immediately, because black might unveil an attack on h5. We have actually g4 supporting firmly h5 first. Rook h8. You might think, what about this pawn here? Again, it backfires. Taking this pawn just seems to backfire, as you might expect. For example, this kind of thing, with the knight coming to f6 now, is really dangerous. This is just bad, very, very bad for black. And here, if the bishop drops back, then white's got an open road to the king and semi-open fold there, which is pretty devastating for black's king safety. Here's an example variation where there's a form pawn on f6, which can basically be decisive as soon as white lines up on the h file. That's going to be mating, a construction like that. So, okay, black plays rook h8, and we have knight h5. So, nice positional plan, get the knight to h5, which does make the whole concept of f4, f5, if that's going to occur later, a little bit more effective, a bit more spice, because g6 is often used to kind of discourage f5, but with a knight on h5 as a prefix to this, it makes the whole thing more effective without the defensive mechanisms like g6 in place. So we have king g8, rook h3. G5 immediately just is no good tactically because the knight is loose here. That's the whole point of having the rook on h8 here. Black's just going to take that, no penalty. So we have rook h3, so defending the knight in advance of that, so renewing the idea of g5 basically, to be able to defend that knight. But also now Freddie, the f pawn, is happier again. He's been blocked on several occasions so far in this game. We have rook b7 being played here. And now Freddie is wanting to play f4 surely, because everything I've said so far is that this is a strategic pawn break, and I would have expected Leela to play this f4, f5 immediately. But actually bishop f4 was played, which is highly Nimzovician. It is overprotecting, for overprotection sake almost. Actually, yeah, it's slightly mysterious. So this is one question initially about this game. Why not f4 straight away? Now, checking with like Stockfish, the latest Stockfish, it seems as though f4 might be plausible. For example, g6, knight f6 check, having the form pawn with f5 now. There's a very tactical solutions here to try and break down black's position, basically. For example, this, where white goes onto that e file now, there's pressure on f5 now, and this should end up being very nice for white. You can see the fragmentation that has occurred. It does seem as though f4 straight away here seems plausible, at least. But bishop f4, very interesting from a really abstract positional perspective. So maybe in some cases, if there's pieces on dark squares, it's another prevention of a liberating f6 at some point. You know, if there was a rook on f on c7, then f6 would be more difficult to play. So this kind of overprotection puts a lot of pressure behind the overprotected pawn, which tries to really discourage any liberation break from black. So that's one of the ideas of the abstract idea of overprotecting a central point as well, not just coordination but preventing of a strategic pawn break. So, but yes, it is preventing also white's f4, f5. We have bishop f8. Plausible seems bishop d8, but white can just whip up an attack in this position. By this stage here, black's idea of attacking c3 is gone. White does appear basically to have a free hand on the king side here without too many concerns at all. For example, bishop f3, we can put the bishop on a more attacking diagonal. I mean, this looks like black's only kind of counterplay, but it's very, very slow. And in the meantime, something like knight f6 check. And this looks like devastating stuff tactically. There's a way of ripping open that g file basically and getting to black's king. These variations show white can crash through tactically. So bishop f8 though was tried, not bishop d8. So we have now queen d1, which says don't care about a2, more concerned about maybe the kingside here. Knight e7 was played. So Stockfish agreed. If bishop takes a2, actually as a preliminary, the bishop can actually drop back here. For example, g5 now, and then taking. And this kind of situation is really dangerous. With knight f6 coming, it looks like a really dangerous position. Just a free hand scenario where white can use the g file potentially and is crushing attack. Basically, there's no real defense to this kind of crushing attack. So it doesn't really matter what black's winning a pawn or pushing the pawn to a4 if black gets mated. So we have knight e7, just ignoring the a2 pawn for a moment. Bishop c1, b5, and now finally it seems here that the time is ripe. According to Alphazero, thinks the time is right for f4. So finally, this seemingly very thematic break is now actually played. Rook b6. Now, on b4, it does seem as though f5 might be playable. For example, if b takes, there's f6. On e takes, this looks very dangerous for taking queen g4. So, let's imagine this scenario, and it's the form pawn on f6 combined with white controlling key squares here. There's no real danger squares here on the queen side. This looks like a very dangerous scenario for black indeed. Just to run this through with the pressure on f7 and also simultaneous queenside pressure. The bishop's a really miserable piece at the moment, and the rook is also pretty miserable actually. So yeah, it looks as though this is extremely unpleasant scenario where white actually kind of just gets in on the queen side with decisive effect. If we run this through from this point here, if f5, that's just desperate. We just take en passant. Yeah, it's all pretty nasty here. There's nasty variations. So yeah, b4 isn't tried. It seems f5 is really cool, is really aggressive. Rook b6. Now, interesting. So this knight, which is installed on h5, is also perhaps made a little bit more effective with bishop a3. The idea to sometimes exchange off the dark square bishop to weaken black on the dark squares even more. Knight g6 offering that dark square bishop exchange. On a5, the bishop can keep on this diagonal with bishop c5 with tempo, and then f5 played here, and actually can swap off on e7 in this scenario to make that f5 a little bit more effective, add a bit more spice here, and then black's king is really in trouble here, as you might expect. The g file is a great asset for white from a tactical perspective. Black's king should be in big trouble, for example, like this as an example. So bishop a3 is working well with the mechanics of this position. So we have the exchange of the dark square bishops now. So black didn't want this bishop takes e7, it seems. But black's counterplay is very, very minimal, it seems, now. And white actually not only protects this pawn, but f5 opening the queen on this diagonal now is also potentially useful. Queen c8, we have rook f3, getting behind f5 again. If queen c8 was preventive, f5 is putting the brakes off again. Queen d8, and that looks at h4. Bit of a nuisance move, but that's parried now. Queen f2, protecting. So white is well and truly now, it seems, geared up for f5. We have b4. If f6 here, in fact, it seems as though f5 is possible here. Rook takes, and this is just nasty. This e-file, this quick e-file, can lead to a tactical disaster for black. For example, like this, even if the h5 knight is lost, There's tactics here, for example, like this, which are absolutely crushing. If the two rooks pin down the knight and control the king escape squares. With the rook on h8, we have tactical disasters emerging like this. So b4 is played. That's actually taken. Takes, and now f5. It does seem very, very thematic now all of a sudden. And very, very dangerous. White, essentially, Leela does seem to, it does seem to remind me of Leela, actually, this, because a form pawn is about to be installed, and what we need then, after a form pawn is installed, it's like having a goal hanger, is a pass from the corner. So once we install that pawn, you expect the pass from the corner. So you'll see, in fact, evidence of this happening. This football metaphor is about to happen. But first, we have rook d1 here, seeing what black is really going to do next. It seems on f6, black could play g6 here. White's still got an edge here. So rook d1 reinforcing d4 in advance. We have queen b7. Rook d2 reinforcing that second rank against things like rook b2. So really positional stuff. Prophylaxis, Nimzovich be proud, making the position super secure before the next strategic operation. Queen c7. And now no rush for any f6. The queen slightly improves with ideas of sometimes g5 now, looking at g7, that coordination point of the knight and queen. We have bishop b5, which introduces queen c1 check. Now king h2 against that. It is also possible technically, but why do this? To allow this thing. Here white's having a small edge. If the queen does take the rook here, this spells some trouble for black. Yeah, this is big trouble actually, this position. If this apparently is the best move, then black gets in trouble. But this is not indulged, just king h2, keeping things much more simple and calm. These pieces are just, not very well placed. So bishop d7, we have queen f2, rook b6, and now rook c2. So getting ready for the queenside invasion as well as a potential form pawn. Rook b2, rook b6, bishop f1. We have queen b8, rook takes b6, a takes, and here it is, the form pawn. See the t-shirt, the form pawn has been installed. Rather than trying to open the file, it's better to install this, especially if the rook there, it's like a stranded rook for at least a few moves to get out. So f6, g6. So now it seems that white really wants to just infiltrate on the queen side now and sort of make use of this pawn laterally in some respect. And we see knight g3, rook e8. We see the start of queenside pressure with queen b2 being played. Queen d8. h5, making sure the knight's got no prospects later with the g6 square. So it comes out that way. King g2, g5. Now the queenside pressure mounts, and there's things like bishop a6 as well to factor in for rook c8. So there's congestion, big congestion, and it's here, total desperation. Black, seeing its demise, just sacked a piece here. If we look, before going into that, if we look at queen b8, queen c2, there's an idea of rook c8. That form pawn's doing a wonderful job here, restricting all of black's pieces over there. And say rook c8, this is just very horrible. For example, like this, bang, check, and mate. Or if knight f8, let's say, then queen b4, queen e7, this is just very restricted for black and very dangerous. Black's clinging on to f7 here in this line. If b3 is taking, just examine this as though this pawn's dangerous. There's bishop d3 here, chasing the rook away from defending f7. So this would be winning for white, crashing through to a checkmate. and the knight's holding up against the 2 queens there. Fine, that's fine, and then it'll be mate on g7, so that's fine. So this scenario is, yeah, it just seems very dangerous. There seems to be an infiltration scenario here, which is unstoppable. So knight f8, yeah, it just seems as though, as you might expect, this just looks extremely unpleasant, untenable, this position. And any time, you know, rook, there's no rook h7 here, but there's also, again, bishop a6, rook c8 ideas as well. So, okay, in that variation, so queen 8 stops at least bishop a6 with rook c8. So it's pretty nasty stuff. So yeah, this sacrifice, going a piece down, knight for 2 pawns, doesn't seem very convincing. Rook f3 hits the queen and protects d4. Queen b4. We have bishop e2 now, bishop c6. It looks like a matter of technique. The queen comes in on the dark squares. Let's have a look though. Picks up that pawn. It's all over, really. Bar the shouting. But how is it actually finished? Well, the king comes up on dark squares. Make sure g4 is not dropped. And here it's just adjudicated as a win for white. So there were 1 or 2 moves here which seemed really abstract positional play rather than going in. So maybe that's to do with the more pattern-based approach to chess, because it does seem plausible that f4 could have been played, for example, instead of bishop f4. But the way it was played, though, is irrefutable. Black's congested pieces weren't going anywhere anyway, so it seems white had solved any potential pressure issues on c3 quite elegantly earlier on, solved those issues and gave itself a luxury time for operations and even seemingly very, very patient waiting moves to see what black would do. Black was fairly helpless basically without too much counterplay, and eventually the f5 break wasn't used to open files, but rather to install the pawn pawn and then go on the queen side and then force black to sack a piece. So it does seem like something we are familiar with from Leela Chess, this game. But let me know if you think it does have a ring true, that kind of familiarity from your perspective, from some games we've seen from Leela as well. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares. Appreciate it. If you enjoyed this game video, then there's a top left box which should appear shortly. You can become a member at chessbowl.net, play against other YouTubers. And on the site, there's also the improved menu, Learn from the Masters YouTube order button, where you can check the analysis of these and other games. Okay, thanks very much.